So I want to look at a number of the favorite SDA claims regarding Rome changing the Sabbath.
Great.
First, notice what she claims in her book, Early Writings. Claiming to be shown this in vision from God, she claims, I saw that God had not changed the Sabbath, for he never changes. But the Pope had changed it from the 7th to the first day of the week, for he was to change times and laws. Then later on in the book, she writes this, quote, the Pope has changed the day of rest from the 7th to the first day. He has thought to change the very commandment that was given to cause man to remember his Creator. He has thought to change the greatest commandment in the Decalogue, and thus make himself equal with God, or even exalt himself above God. So the story goes that Constantine laid the way for the papacy to eventually change the Sabbath and exalt Sunday as the Christian Sabbath. We will get into another one of their claims regarding this charge in a moment, but I want to focus in on the papacy here. Does the Roman Catholic Church teach that the Pope changed the Sabbath?
No. And so it's interesting. The first thing I'd say for any Adventist listening to this, which Pope is she talking about? I mean, there's a well-documented list of popes. So which Pope did it and when did this happen?
Sylvester I.
Perfect. And so when did this happen? Right? Like, let's get really specific about dates. So if you claim, the 4th century, because after Constantine, you're in a real pickle because we have a lot of evidence that in the 100s, people were celebrating on Sunday. Now, they don't believe Sunday is the Jewish Sabbath. So you'll find plenty of distinctions between describing the Sabbath and describing the Lord's Day, but it's abundantly clear that the day Christians rested and worshiped together was on the Lord's Day. And so, again, the timeline just doesn't work to point to later popes. So I'll give you a few examples. First, I want to point to a scholarly resource, and then I want to look at some primary texts. So there's a book called The Earliest History of the Christian Gathering. The subtitle is Origin, Development, and Content of the Christian Gathering in the 1st to 3rd centuries by Valery Alekin. And all he's doing is looking at the historical evidence of the 1st century, 2nd century, 3rd century. So stopping at the year 200. All of this well before Ellen White's timeline. And he says, Christians began to hold periodic gatherings not later than the middle of the 1st century, 20 years after Jesus' death. Insofar as the sources allow any inference, the periodical gathering of Christians took place on Sundays. They could be held at various locations, although most took place in private houses. So the nature of Christian worship was such that it was clearly happening in the days of the house church, well before Constantine. In this period he's looking at of the first 200 years of Christianity, and it's happening on Sundays. Now we can see this in several different sources. For instance, St. Justin Martyr in First Apology. Now, this is even earlier than Irenaeus. Irenaeus is writing about 180. Justin Martyr is about 20 years earlier than this. Now, Justin Martyr is someone you would be hard to accuse of importing pagan ideas, because the whole notion of First Apology is that he's arguing in defense, apology. He's arguing in defense of Christianity against paganism. He's telling the pagans that they're wrong, which is why he's not, Justin who peacefully retired in the wilderness. He's Justin Martyr. He confronts the Roman emperor directly by letter to accuse him of teaching false things. And in the process of this, he describes the nature of Christian worship. And he says, and on the day called Sunday, all who live in cities or in the country gather together to one place. And then he describes the nature of this. The memoirs of the apostles or the writings of the prophets are read, and then you have the celebration of the Eucharist. And so it's very clear what's happening here. And it's very clear that it's happening on Sunday. And he explains, Sunday is the day on which we all hold our common assembly because it is the first day on which God, having wrought a change in the darkness and matter, made the world, and Jesus Christ, our Savior, on the same day rose from the dead. Now, other early Christian sources will actually give a full Trinitarian account of Sunday and say it's on Sunday that the Father creates the world, It's on Sunday that Jesus rises from the dead, and it's on Sunday that the Holy Spirit comes in Pentecost. And so Father, Son, and Spirit are recognized, acknowledged, worshiped, and adored properly on Sunday. Now, as an aside, I want to just make this point because this is one of the deepest areas of misunderstanding. As Catholics, we believe you should worship God every day. And you can actually fulfill your Mass obligation by going to Mass on a Saturday evening. So if you're someone who wants to both have Christian worship and, honor the historic Jewish Sabbath in some way, as long as you don't think that's binding on other people, you can rest on Saturday. No one's telling you can't. And you can go to church on Saturday. We have Masses at almost every church in the country on Saturday, if that's what you want. So the idea that we're just like against people worshiping God on Saturday is demonstrably and obviously false. But returning to Justin Martyr. So he's explaining why it's happening on Sunday. And then he says, for he was crucified, Jesus, of course, on the day before that of Saturn. So he was crucified the day before Saturday, Friday. And on the day after that of Saturn, which is the day of the sun, having appeared to his apostles and disciples, he taught them these things which we have submitted to you also for your consideration. That's 160. Way too early for Ellen White's timeline. And he also makes clear that he doesn't think Christians are bound by the Jewish Sabbath anymore. And he makes this clear in it's called Dialogue with Trypho, or sometimes called Dialogue with Trypho, a Jew, which is Jewish-Christian debate. And this is from about 150. And he says that one of the charges that Jews raise against Christians is this, that we live not after the law and are not circumcised in the flesh as your fathers were, and do not observe Sabbaths as you do. And so he acknowledged, and he doesn't disagree with this charge. He thinks this is true. And he then says, do you not see the elements? This is much later. I want to make sure clear. I'm jumping here from paragraph 10 to paragraph 23. He says, do you see that the elements are not idle and keep no Sabbaths? Remain as you were born. In other words, in nature, things don't just naturally come to rest on the Sabbath. For if there was no need of circumcision before Abraham, or of the observance of Sabbaths, of feasts, and sacrifices before Moses, no more need is there of them now. Now look, a Sabbatarian might disagree with all of that. My point is simply, this is what Christians believed in the 100s. And that doesn't fit with the idea that this is some medieval invention. And this is not just Justin giving his personal interpretation, or Irenaeus giving his personal interpretation, or Tertullian, or Origen, or any of these people. They are speaking on behalf of what Christians are doing and how they're living. And no one is saying, hey, this is crazy heretical. You're violating the 10 Commandments. Imagine this. Imagine for a moment that the early Christian church really was Seventh-day Adventist in its beliefs. I mean, obviously in its structure, not, but just imagine had Adventist beliefs. And imagine someone is writing on your behalf to the Roman emperor, very publicly announcing that you worship on Sunday, and you in fact don't. You worship only on Saturday. We would expect to see a lot of pushback and Christians saying, hey, that's not what we believe at all. We don't see anything like that. Rather, these men were revered and honored as if they are speaking accurately on behalf of the Christian church. Now, I want to add one more source, and the dating of this one is a little tricky. The Didache. So some are going to put it in the 100s, but there are plenty of scholars who argue that this is the oldest text outside of the Bible in Christianity. Then they did it even back to like the mid 50s AD, somewhere in there. So in the first century, older than parts of the New Testament. It's not part of the Bible. It doesn't claim to be written by an apostle. It's an early Christian attempt at summarizing the teaching of the 12 apostles, which is what the name Didache means. It's the teaching of the 12. And in it, it says, but every Lord's Day, gather yourselves together and break bread and give thanksgiving, the Eucharist in Greek, after having confessed your transgressions, that your sacrifice may be pure. And so you have that clearly pointing to worship being on the Lord's Day. And of course, we also see the Apostle John in Revelation 1 talking about the Lord's Day. And I know the standard Adventist response is the Lord's Day must have meant Saturday because the day of the Lord in Isaiah is Saturday. But every use of the phrase the Lord's Day in Greek, in early Christian texts, points to Sunday. And this is remarkably clear You remember earlier when I said the Apostle John had two well-known students, one of them St. Polycarp of Smyrna, the other one is St. Ignatius of Antioch. And Ignatius, in his letter to the Magnesians, he is on his way to be martyred. He's the first bishop of Antioch, and he is in 107, about 7 years after the death of his teacher John. He is being himself brought to Rome to be martyred. And along the way, he writes 7 letters. And in one of them to the church in Magnesia, he says this: therefore, those who are brought up in the ancient order of things, that is within, Judaism, have come to the possession of a new hope, no longer observing the Sabbath, but living in the observance of the Lord's day, on which also our life has sprung up again by him and by his death. So it's abundantly clear in 107. There's not a lot. I mean, there's a couple years wiggle room in terms of where we date Ignatius's letters, but pretty broad consensus is between the latter part of the first decade of the 100. So maybe 105 to 110. 107 is a best estimate. He's abundantly clear that Christians don't worship on the Sabbath, but on the Lord's Day, on Sunday. And then when you have that, it makes sense of Revelation 1:10, where John says that he was in the Spirit on the Lord's Day. And so all the book of Revelation is presented from that Sunday kind of perspective. Now, all that's to say, you could say every Christian that we know of in the 1st century, the 2nd century, and the 3rd century got it wrong. But that's a separate argument from the fact that Ellen White claiming all of this is post-Constantinian is demonstrably untrue. I mean, it is obviously, she is off by several centuries, and there's just no evidence of the position that she's claiming. It just is so abundantly clear that this is false. So from a theological perspective, we can debate it. I trust the early Christians more than I trust Ellen White. From a historical perspective, it's absolutely undeniable that she has no idea what she's talking about as a historian, as a church historian, as someone making these allegedly prophetic claims about church history. Those claims are provably false. And that should call into question a great deal of her authority. And I hope for those listening, it does.